So I was arguing with a couple of secularists on the idea of the Christian nation, right? But that was obviously presupposing my paradigm, the American covenant presupposition, or the covenant presupposition, right? To like the architecture of the American system and all of that, even American identity, right? Like chosen nation, chosen people, like that has nothing to do with supremacy or anything like that, right? It has to do with just being defined as a people and belonging and community and identity and things like that. That is given by God through that, it's about like through that spirituality. At least that is based on the covenant principle, covenant identity, basically. And so I'm arguing with a couple of secularists over the idea, and I'm just seeing like whether there's substance or my position, right, able to be defended or so against theirs, and how they compare and stuff like that. And so I think the exchange went overall well. Overall went well for me. Clearly exposed secular ideology for, not being a faithful interpretation of the country, right? So anyway, this person, because this was on, when this person was responding to me about Richard Carrier or whatever, and this is what they said to me. This person said that Thomas Jefferson, the primary author of the Declaration, which has zero legal weight at all, was a deist, not a Christian. He used creator and nature's God to appeal to a broader audience, reflecting Enlightenment, thought, and a universal God, not specifically the Christian Trinity or divinity of Jesus. The Declaration itself uses broad, non-sectarian terms like nature's God, creator, and divine providence, allowing diverse faiths to agree on foundational principles. Otherwise, words like God, which is of pagan origin, or Yahweh, Jesus, would have been used. Both the U.S. Constitution and subsequent Supreme Court rulings prohibit the government from compelling anyone to perform a religious act, including swearing a religious oath, so adding God to any oath actually goes against the nation's founding liberty for all except the slaves held by Christians, Native Americans, women, while John Adams praised the importance of morality and religion, not specifically Christianity, for any constitution to succeed. Historical records do not specifically indicate him openly praising the Mosaic Constitution, the laws given to Moses in the Bible, which Acts 15 says does not apply to non-Hebrews. Early Americans did not read the Old Testament as a political blueprint. American law draws heavily from British common law for its structure, like courts, juries, but incorporates Native American legal traditions, primarily through treaties that establish tribes as sovereign entities, influencing the U.S. Constitution's Commerce Clause and the concept of the federal trust responsibility, creating a unique body of federal Indian law focused on distinct tribal sovereignty. The concept of America being a Christian nation came after the Civil War. James Madison is credited as the chief author and the primary architect of the First Amendment. James Madison was baptized Anglican, but remained private about his faith, showing leanings towards early 19th century Unitarianism, and given his quotes from part of one of my comments. Hebraic covenantalism influenced federalism more than classical paganism is not accurate at all. American law draws heavily from British common law for its structure, like juries, but incorporates Native American legal traditions, primarily through treaties that establish tribes as sovereign entities, influencing the U.S. Constitution's Commerce Clause and the concept of the federal trust responsibility, creating a unique body of federal Indian law focused on distinct tribal sovereignty. The concept of America being a Christian nation came after the Civil War. As far as African-American abolitionists invoked the Exodus as America's true moral foundation, they did so to frame slavery in America as a profound moral sin, mirroring their own oppression and promising divine intervention for freedom, seeing themselves as a new chosen people, not the nation's moral foundation. Also, slave owners also cited the Bible to rationalize slavery. And then he says, in short, I did zero research. I'm just parroting invented talking points and not write lies. I was like, hold on, okay. Sorry, I kind of got lost with all the replies, right? Because there were so many replies and they're all linking to different responses. But down here he says, he quoted me when I said same moral covenantal foundation, right? And then he says, and Norse teaches fidelity, abstinence, moderation, cleanliness, and even attested to by Tacitus or so. And I responded with, the British common law itself was already saturated with biblical, covenantal, and Christian assumptions. American law is structurally derived from British common law, which itself developed within a Christian covenantal worldview. The claim that American law draws heavily from British common law is absolutely correct, but it does not refute Hebrew covenantal influence. In fact, it unintentionally supports it. British common law itself did not arise in a vacuum. It developed inside a deeply Christian culture that had already absorbed biblical covenantal assumptions for centuries. English constitutionalism from Magna Carta onward was shaped by Christian moral theology, natural law thinking, and biblical ideas of justice, oath, and accountability. When colonists inherited common law, they inherited a Christianized legal tradition, not a neutral or pagan one. On Hebrew covenantalism, no serious historian claims that America copied Mosaic law wholesale. That would be a straw man. The claim is more modest and more defensible. Hebraic covenantal ideas shaped how Americans understood political authority, legitimacy, and obligation, even when the legal mechanics came from England. So you see this most clearly. You see this most clearly in how Americans understood political order itself. The founding generation repeatedly described society as a compact, covenant, and mutual oath. That language is not pagan and not native. It is biblical. The Declaration of Independence is explicitly framed as a moral oath made under God's judgment, appealing to a supreme judge of the world and relying on divine providence. This is covenantal logic, not classical republicanism. Pagan systems like Athens or Rome grounded authority in custom, virtue, or fate. Biblical covenant grounds authority and moral obligation before God, consent, and accountability. That's the difference. That difference matters. Some founders, especially Benjamin Franklin, admired aspects of the Iroquois system, particularly their federal structure, but admiration is not the same thing as foundational influence. The Iroquois Confederacy did not provide a theory of natural rights, equality grounded in universal human dignity, written constitutionalism, separation of powers as Americans understood it, covenantal oaths under divine moral law. Even scholars who argue for Iroquois influence generally concede it was structural inspiration at most, not moral or philosophical grounding. In other words, Native American systems may have illustrated that federal arrangements were possible, but they did not supply the moral anthropology, legal philosophy, or rights framework of the American Republic. This is also the moral covenant tradition and heritage, and the so-called deists built upon Jefferson. Benjamin Franklin, Jefferson literally cut out miracles of the Gospels, but kept Jesus' moral teaching, which he considered the highest ethical system ever produced. And then he responded to me. He said, like, British common law drew from ancient customary laws of Anglo-Saxon England, unified and standardized by royal courts after the 1066 Norman conquest under Henry II, incorporating local traditions and evolving through judicial precedent, case law, rather than written codes, becoming a unified national law system based on judge-made decisions. By the 18th and 19th centuries, legal debates clarified that while Christianity can influence law, the law protected actions like blasphemy that breached peace, not just offenses against God. If Christianity were part of the common law, statutes could change it. Since Christian dogmas are beyond statute, they can't be legally part of it. Landmark cases like Bowman versus Secular Society confirm that Christianity isn't a direct legal component of English common law. Yes, the founding fathers frequently used concepts like compact, covenant, and mutual oath to describe society's foundation using Enlightenment social contract theory. And he quotes me and says, pagan systems like Athens or Rome grounded authority in custom, virtue, or fate, end quote. And they responded with, that was the state and culture, not their religion, and there are far more than just Rome and Greece. And he says, the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson, whose Bible removed everything but Jesus. Thomas Jefferson was a theist, believing in a rational creator God, but rejecting traditional Christian doctrines like divinity and miracles. Also, it's not a law document, has never been treated as a law document. It was a letter of intent of treason against a theocratic king. The Iroquois Confederacy, Haudenosaunee, if I say that correctly, provided fundamental rights within their Great Law of Peace, the Guyana-Shagoa, including freedom of speech, thought, and religion, rights to a fixed body of accessible law, and mechanisms for direct input on crucial matters, ensuring leaders, sachems, could be removed for misconduct by the women, clan mothers, who appointed them, established a matriarchal consensus-driven system with protections for all people, land and foreign relations, provided rights and refuge for foreigners, incorporating them into the nation with equal privilege, except voting in the main council, comprised of representatives from each nation, guided by clan mothers. Since I noticed you just skipped over the cited quote said from founders, all of which counter your entire argument. Very telling. Guess I didn't skip anything. Probably didn't see it because there's a lot of comments. But anyways, I responded with, it is true that English common law developed after 1066 through judicial precedent rather than a comprehensive written code, and that Henry II unified diverse local customs. However, it is false to conclude that this process excluded Christian or biblical influence. Common law emerged within a Christian moral universe, not a neutral one. Judges did not invent law ex nihilo. They assumed shared moral axioms about justice, obligation, oath-keeping, marriage, property, and crime axioms shaped by centuries of Christian theology, and behind it, Hebraic moral law. Landmark cases like Bowen versus Secular Society, 1917, clarified that Christianity was not formally enacted as a statutory component of English law, but this proves a narrow point. Christianity was not legally binding as dogma. It does not prove that Christian moral concepts were absent from common law reasoning. English jurists long held that Christianity was part of the moral substrate of the law, even if not enforceable as theology. That is why blasphemy was punished as a breach of public peace, not because courts were secular, but because they assumed a Christian moral consensus and translated it into civil terms. In other words, Christianity influenced what counted as peace, justice, and order, even when courts avoided enforcing doctrine. That distinction actually strengthens rather than weakens the covenantal argument. Yes, the founders use social contract language familiar from Locke and Enlightenment discourse, but covenantal language in America predates Locke and persists alongside him. Colonial charters, church covenants, town compacts, and early constitutions consistently describe political society as a moral covenant under God, not merely a prudential agreement among individuals. Locke himself did not invent this framework. As Victor Nouveau shows, Locke's political theory is inseparable from his theology and from biblical covenantalism, especially the idea that authority is conditional, accountable, and revocable for injustice. That is precisely why American federalism looks closer to Hebraic distributed authority than to Hobbesian sovereignty. Calling covenant language, quote, just Enlightenment theory, end quote, erases its biblical genealogy, especially as mediated through Reformed and dissenting Protestant traditions. Jefferson was not an Orthodox Christian, and no serious scholar needs to deny that. But the skeptic's conclusion goes too far. Jefferson explicitly identified himself as a Christian, quote, in the sense of the true and pure doctrines of Jesus, end quote. His life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth removes miracles and metaphysics, but it preserves the ethical core of Christ's teaching, precisely the part most relevant to law and self-government. More importantly, the Declaration of Independence does not function as a church confession. It functions as a moral justification for political authority. It appeals to nature's God and unalienable rights, and a moral law above kings reflects a theistic moral order, not Enlightenment materialism. Whether Jefferson was a deist is less important than the fact that he assumed a transcendent moral law that judges political power, a fundamentally biblical idea, even when philosophically reframed. And while the Declaration is not statutory law, it has always functioned as interpretive authority in American constitutional thought. Courts, abolitionists, civil rights leaders, and statesmen have consistently treated it as expressing the moral expressing the moral logic of the regime. I would add that Daniel Eleazar and Donald Lutz, two scholars that believe that it's possible to interpret the Declaration as a covenant oath under God. It also represents the thinking of a people. The Iroquois Confederacy's great law of peace is an impressive political achievement, and some founders were aware of it, but claims that it provided the foundation of American constitutionalism do not withstand scrutiny. The Iroquois system lacked key features of the U.S. Constitution: separation of powers, judicial review, written enumerated rights, federal supremacy, and representative republicanism as understood in the Anglo-American law. Its matriarchal clan system, consensus governance, the kinship-based authority bear little structural resemblance to the American state. Where influence likely exists is symbolic and rhetorical, not structural. By contrast, the documentary trail linking American political thought to Hebraic covenantalism, Reformed theology, English constitutionalism, and biblical republicanism is massive and explicit. Petraeus Caneus, Joannes Aldusis, Harrington, and later American writers consciously studied Israel, not the Iroquois, as a political model. Acknowledging native contributions does not require displacing the overwhelming documented biblical covenantal framework. The American founding deliberately avoided a theocratic state, but it did not reject Christian moral reasoning. Instead, it translated biblical concepts, covenant, fallibility, limited power, moral law above rulers into a constitutional order suitable for a plural society. This is not a betrayal of Christianity. It is precisely how Christian political theology had long argued civil authority should function. That's how I'm going to respond to other stuff later. So then I said, I think I already read this part. Yeah. Down here, responded with, quoted me when I said Christian moral universe. Then he says, I repeat, Norse teaches fidelity, abstinence, moderation, cleanliness, even attested to by Tacitus. Okay, that doesn't prove anything. And then he quotes me again, saying peace, justice, and order. And also when I said authority is conditional, accountable, and revocable for injustice. He says, which already existed in other religions and cultures. And then he quoted me again, saying Jefferson was not an orthodox Christian. And he says, because he basically is a deist, not Christian at all. So he assumes that deists cannot operate under a Christian moral framework, right? And then quoted me when I said, his life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth removes miracles and metaphysics, but it preserves the ethical core of Christ's teaching, end quote. And he says, which if one actually studies other religions and cultures was universal. Then he said, when I said nature's God, he said not Yahweh, otherwise they would have said it, which is retarded. But anyway, the quoted me when I said whether Jefferson was a theist is less important than the fact that he assumed a transcendent moral law that judges political power, a fundamentally biblical idea, even when philosophically reframed. And he says another universal idea. So he's not really explaining anything really. And he said, as far as the founders, he gave me all these quotes, right? He says, give me the quote from Thomas Jefferson in a letter to Horatio Spafford, 1814, when he says, in every country and every age, the priest has been hostile to liberty. He is always in alliance with the despot, abetting his abuses in return for protection to his own. It is an error alone that needs the support of government. Truth can stand by itself. And then this other quote by James Madison, letter to Bradford in 1774. It says, religious bondage shackles and debilitates the mind and unfits it for every noble enterprise. And then what was the other quote from Thomas Jefferson? In a letter to Alexander von Humboldt. It says, history, I believe, furnishes no example of a priest-ridden people maintaining a free civil government. This marks the lowest grade of ignorance of which their civil as well as religious leaders will always avail themselves for their own purposes, end quote. Then he quotes James Madison saying, quote, the civil government functions with complete success by the total separation of the church and state from state. And then what else? It says, in addition to America's real religion, it says, quote, when a religion is good, I conceive it will support itself, and when it does not support itself and God does not take care to support it, so that its professors are obligated to call for help of the civil power, it's a sign, I apprehend, of its being a bad one. And quote, that's Benjamin Franklin, letter to Richard Price, 1780. And then he says, quotes another one, says, as I understand the Christian religion, it was and is a revelation, but how has it happened that millions of fables, tales, legends have been blended with both Jewish and Christian revelation that have made them the most bloody religion that ever existed? It's from John Adams, letter to F.A. Vanderkemp. Another one is from Thomas Jefferson. It says, the hocus-pocus phantasm of a godlike, another Cerberus with one body and three heads, had its birth and growth in the blood of thousands and thousands of martyrs. Right, in reference to the Trinity, right? And this other one is, quote, Christianity neither is nor ever was part of the common law. Thomas Jefferson, letter to Dr. Thomas Cooper, February 10, 1814. Quote, no religious doctrine shall be established by law. That's by Elbridge, Gary, Annals of Congress. Quote, persecution is not an original feature in any religion, but it is always the strongly marked feature of all religions established by law. Take away the law establishment, and every religion reassumes its original benignity. As is Thomas Paine, The Rights of Man, 1791. Quote, gives me another quote. It says, strongly guarded as is the separation between religion and government in the Constitution of the United States, the danger of encroachment by ecclesiastical bodies may be illustrated by precedents already furnished in their short history, end quote. It's by James Madison. And then this is the one that obviously is easy to deal with. The government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. This one, the Treaty of Tripoli, obviously, from John Adams. And then I deal with all of these later. It says, I almost shudder at the thought of alluding to the most fatal example of the abuses of grief which the history of mankind has preserved. The cross, consider with calamities that engine of grief has produced. John Adams, letter to Thomas Jefferson. Question with boldness even the existence of a God, because if there be one, he must more approve of the homage of reason than that of blinded, folded fear. It's from Thomas Jefferson. So I am for freedom of religion and against all maneuvers to bring about a legal ascendancy of one sect over another. Founding Father Thomas Jefferson. And then millions of innocent men and women and children since the introduction of Christianity have been burnt, tortured, fined, imprisoned, yet we have not advanced an inch towards uniformity. What has been the effect of coercion to make one half the world's fools and the other half hypocrites, to support roguery and error all over the earth? Thomas Jefferson. On the dogmas of religion, as distinguished from moral principles, all mankind from the beginning of the world to this day have been quarreling, fighting, burning, and torturing one another for abstractions unintelligible to themselves and to all others, and absolutely beyond the comprehension of the human mind. Thomas Jefferson. So a lot of Thomas Jefferson quotes. So as I addressed him, I said, when he said other religions, Norse, pagan, etc., right, brought up how they taught virtues like fidelity and moderation. I said that this argument confuses the existence of moral virtues with the structure of moral authority. Yes, many cultures taught virtues. No one disputes that, but what matters for political foundation is not whether virtues existed, but how they were justified, whether they were universal, whether they constrained political power, whether they grounded rights rather than hierarchy. And then Norse ethics, as Tacitus describes them, were tribal, honor-based, and exclusionary. They did not teach universal human equality. They transcended moral law, binding rulers and ruled alike. The accountability of authority to a higher moral order. Consent as a moral obligation rather than tribal loyalty. Those features are not merely universal ideas. They emerge specifically from Hebraic covenant theology and its Christian development. Ancient pagan systems, Greek, Roman, Norse, assumed hierarchy as natural. Christianity did not merely affirm virtue, it redefined moral anthropology. All humans made in the image of God, rulers accountable to divine law, conscience inviolable authority, conditional and revocable for injustice. That is not generic morality, that is covenantal moral structure, right, which is inherited from the Hebrew tradition, right? And then when he said Jefferson was a deist, not a Christian, right? I told him that this is a category error and a dodge. No serious scholar claims Jefferson was an orthodox Trinitarian. That's irrelevant. The issue is whether Jefferson operated within a Christian moral universe, not whether he affirmed creeds. Jefferson explicitly said he was a Christian according to the moral teachings of Jesus, which he considered the purest ethical system ever articulated. His life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth removes miracles, yes, but it preserves the covenantal ethics of universal moral accountability, human equality, love of neighbor, opposition to tyranny, justice over power. That is not generic morality. That is the moral core Christianity had already impressed upon Western civilization. Jefferson did not derive those ethics from Norse sagas or Stoic manuals. He explicitly attributes them to Jesus. You could call it Lockean Christianity, since Locke is one of Jefferson's heroes who also is influenced by Jesus, right? And when he said that those moral ideas are universal anyway, I responded to him. I said, this is where your position collapses. If these ideas were truly universal, then why didn't pagan democracies abolish slavery? Why didn't Norse societies develop universal rights? Why didn't Athens extend equality to women, foreigners, or slaves? Why did abolition, civil rights, and resistance movements in America appeal to biblical language, not pagan philosophy? Universality, in hindsight, isn't equal. Universality isn't equal. It's not equal to it's not equal to universality in history. Ideas become universal because a tradition successfully universalizes them. Christianity did exactly that. And then his retarded point that he said when he said nature's God is not Yahweh because it doesn't explicitly say it, right? I told him that this is a linguistic fallacy from when I looked it up, right? 18th century Protestant political theology routinely used terms like nature's God, providence, supreme judge, creator, those kind of words, and they said these were standard Enlightenment era theological expressions, not denials of biblical deism. The Declaration doesn't invoke Zeus, Odin, or reason itself. It invokes a creator, moral law, judgment of nations, divine accountability. That conceptual package is biblical even when phrased philosophically. What proof do you have that Christians couldn't presuppose the Christian God? And then when he said, founders oppose priests and religious coercion. And I said, yeah, that is true, and it actually supports my position, not yours. The founders were opposing state churches, coercive ecclesiastical hierarchies, priestly domination of conscience. That opposition comes directly from Protestant dissenting traditions, not from paganism. Madison, Jefferson, and Franklin weren't rejecting Christianity. They were rejecting magisterial control of faith. This distinction is crucial. So opposition to ecclesiastical power doesn't equal rejection of Christian moral foundations. In fact, their argument assumes Christianity is true enough to stand without coercion. Franklin explicitly says a true religion doesn't need the silver sword. That's not secularism, that's theology. And he says, Christianity caused violence and coercion. I responded with that this is a weak argument, right? But this is an argument against corrupted Christianity, not against Christian moral foundations. Jefferson, Madison, and others repeatedly distinguished between the Christianity of Christ versus the Christianity of power, right? The imperial church, those kind of things, what it became later. Roger Williams, Anabaptists, the radical Reformation abolitionists, Frederick Douglass, etc., right? The fact that Christianity generated its own internal critique of coercion is precisely the point, that pagan systems didn't do that. And I said that you keep doing the same thing. And he says that this idea existed everywhere or elsewhere, right? Therefore everything is irrelevant, or Christianity is irrelevant, I mean. And I said that's a genetic fallacy. What matters is which ideas shape the American moral imagination, which language Americans use to justify authority and resistance, which tradition empowered the oppressed to claim equality, and historically that tradition is biblical and Christian, not Norse, Greek, or Roman. And I said that Norse ritual violence, slavery, blood, sacrifice, conquest ethics, indigenous systems practicing slavery, torture, ritual killing, internal tribal extermination, right? Basically because this guy's appealing to basically other religious societies. But he's like pointing out there, supposedly where we got our system from. But he doesn't bother like pointing out some of the atrocities that's committed in those societies or so. But he points out, this was the problems with Christianity and all that. That there were no problems in the other things that he said we're borrowing from these other systems that were pagan and indigenous. And then I said, pagan societies where democracy explicitly depended on slavery, infanticide, and exclusion, that Christianity is not evaluated at the level of its ethical ideas. Imago Dei, love of enemy, universal dignity, conscience, right? Yeah, love thy neighbor, right? Locke emphasized, what also Jefferson emphasized, right? And but it's evaluated at the level of its worst historical failures, right? What's surprising is that pagan Norse and indigenous systems are treated at the level of abstract virtues, while Christianity is judged almost exclusively by its historical abuses. That's not a fair comparison, that's moral cherry picking. And this is the Treaty of Tripoli, right? This is that the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. And let me see, and I said, what was the book? Yes, I was reading from this book that I have. When he said that, right, because I also read all this other stuff from this book called The Fake Founding Father Quotes, Examined, were the founders atheists and theists, by Dave Miller. Goes over, even the person who wrote the Treaty of Tripoli does not even agree with the secular interpretation. So I mentioned the footnote and the book that he cited in from the author, Joe Barlow, that in his book, I forgot what it's called, I put it in there, to the ordered privilege, I think it was, or the ordered privileged nation, I think it was, advice to the privileged nation, I think it was, yeah. There's a footnote in there that clarifies, that reinforces what I'm saying, right? That it reflects dissenting consciousness or dissenting Christian conscience, and it's about federal power, none of which is secularism. So I said that the Treaty of Tripoli does not prove American secularism. It reflects federal disestablishment, a principle rooted in dissenting Christian theology and federalism, not Enlightenment, a religion. Saying the federal government lacks an official religion is not the same as saying American law, political thought, or moral assumptions were non-Christian. The treaty addresses foreign diplomacy and jurisdictional limits, not the civilizational or moral foundations of the American order. The United States was not founded as an ecclesiastical or confessional state, but that does not make it secular in the modern sense. Its political structure is covenantal rather than ecclesiastical. Authority is conditional, power is limited, rulers are accountable to a higher moral law, and government rests on mutual oaths rather than divine kingship or clerical rule. So the Treaty of Tripoli reflects this federal restraint, not the absence of Christianity, but the refusal of the federal government to act as a church. That position arises from dissenting Protestant theology, not secularism. Not from secularism. And what was the other thing? Some other stuff I could have said. Oh, anyway, let me just continue to his responses. He quotes me, he says, how they were justified, whether they were universal, whether they constrained political power, whether they grounded rights rather than hierarchy. In response to me, he said, majority of the time, the religion itself, the Havamal, for example, talks about hospitality, taking care of the less fortunate, fidelity, abstinence, moderation, spreading wealth. The rest of the time, a functioning society. And he quotes me, when I said Norse ethics, and as Tacitus describes them, were tribal, honor-based, and exclusionary, did not teach universal human equality, transcendent moral law, binding rulers and ruled alike, the accountability of authorities to a higher moral order, consent as a moral obligation rather than tribal loyalty. He said that this is where you need the halls of academia, because the actual history is not as you stated it, even though it does not actually cite me any actual academic sources, right? And then when I said ancient pagan systems, Greek, Norse, Roman, Norse assumed hierarchy as natural. Christianity did not merely affirm virtue. It redefined moral anthropology. He responded to me, he said, Christianity has hierarchy as well. Don't fool yourself. Norse culture also held those in power accountable. Even kings could be brought to court. Yes, they had a full legal system. And when I said rulers accountable to divine law, conscience inviolable, authority conditional and revocable, for injustice that is not generic morality, that is covenantal moral structure. And then he responded to me, he responded to that, he said, if you had actually studied history and comparative religion, you would know it is the same thing for pagans. And then he said, when I said this is a category error and a dodge, no serious scholar claims Jefferson was an Orthodox Trinitarian. That's irrelevant. And then he said, deists are not Christians, never have been, right? Which is just totally misunderstanding everything. And so when I said Jefferson explicitly said he was a Christian according to the moral teachings of Jesus, end quote. And then he said, not because he actually followed him. That's what he said. And then when I said human equality, love of neighbor, opposition to tyranny, justice over power, he said, that's why Christians owned slaves into the 1800s, right? And then when I said, why didn't pagan democracies abolish slavery? Why didn't Norse societies develop universal rights? Why didn't Athens extend equality to women, foreigners, or slaves? And he said, Christians owned slaves into the 1800s, quoting the Bible the entire time. They even ran the transatlantic slave trade. Every culture has done slavery as they eventually grew out of it. It was cultural, not religious. The Norse did have universal rights. Even thralls could earn money, get married, have a family. It was illegal to beat them. You really need to actually research things and stop spewing old debunked talking points. And now I said, when I said nature's God, providence, supreme judge, creator, these were standard Enlightenment era theological expression. He said used by pagans as well, general terms, not names, specifics. And when I said the declaration doesn't invoke Zeus, Odin, or reason itself, and he says doesn't invoke Yahweh either, or Jesus, right? Right, but he gives no basis why I could not presuppose, right? I've given, and I'll still respond to all of this, right? But I give him plenty of justifiable common sense reasons why you ought to presuppose the God of Christ and not this neutrality that eventually leads to polytheism, which makes our system incoherent, right? So where was I? When I said state churches, coercive ecclesiastical hierarchies, priestly domination of conscience, that opposition comes directly from Protestant dissenting traditions, not from paganism. Then he says, never said it came from paganism. And then their quotes, they blame Christianity for death and bloodshed. Right, because like typical secularists, they don't distinguish between the various forms of Christianity, like the way I'm calling America a Christian nation does not even reflect the historical understanding of it, because the ideas change, and these secularists ignores all of that, evolve all this evolution of thought, right? Because he goes to the origins and he thinks that is the only way the idea can ever truly be authentic or something, and that it didn't, like other people's, they didn't take the same ideas and then filter them through their presuppositions, and then maybe it takes on a new form, even making the original obsolete, right? And then, where was I? When I said, yeah. When I said opposition to ecclesiastical power doesn't equal rejection of Christian moral foundations. In fact, the argument assumes Christianity is true enough to stand without coercion. Franklin explicitly says a true religion doesn't need the civil sword. That's not secularism, that's theology. And he said, you really should read those quotes. And then when I said, this is an argument against corrupted Christianity, not against Christian moral foundations, then he gives me these, like a list, look at the behavior of the church, right? Because once again, he's pointing out the atrocities and all that, right? Because I guess to him, Christianity is just pure evil, right? And so all of these, just, I'm going to read every, like, he just gives me like witch hunts, all these things, assuming it's all correct, right? Thousands, and it gives me the LGBTQ thing. What else? 10, 15 million indigenous people died or whatever. So he gives me all these like so-called facts or so. And then he says, the church's outright refusal to accept anyone different, including LGBTQ, putting politics in, even though that's not true, there's plenty of churches that accept them. And it says, putting politics and political identity markers over faith, rationalizing any reason to defy the commands of Jesus. And then when I said the fact that Christianity generated its own internal critique of coercion is precisely the point. Pagan systems didn't do that. He said again, actually research the history and religion. Pagan systems did that stuff regularly. Okay, but couldn't he like cite me anything so I can look at it? I said this idea, when I said this idea existed elsewhere, therefore Christianity is irrelevant. And he said that I never said that. You put words in my mouth. That claim I made a logical fallacy and didn't know you were allowed. Now he calls me a liar. And then when I said which tradition empowered the oppressed to claim equality, and historically that tradition is biblical and Christian, not Norse, Greek, or Roman. And he said, again, actually research the history and religion. Pagan systems did that stuff regularly. And then I think this is the same post. I'll tell you, sometimes stuff got posted like twice or so. So I have to find my place. Or whether using the same, I don't know. It just says indigenous systems practicing slavery, torture, ritual killing, intertribal extermination. And if you read the Bible in full, so does the Bible, it's full of it. Right? Because everyone has their problems with their societies, right? Pagan societies were democratic. When I said pagan societies were democracy, explicitly dependent on slavery, in fact, deciding exclusion. And he says, yet the Romans, for example, never required the Hebrews to sacrifice to their gods. Christians owning slaves in the 1800s. Democracy is the people voting, that is all it is. And then Imago Dei, when I say Imago Dei, right, it's Latin. He says it's Latin, a completely different language tree. This guy doesn't get it. It's a biblical concept in Genesis, right? The image of God in man, and is even in the New Testament, since Christ fulfills the being the new Adam, right? The Adam of God. We see Christ, the redeemed image, right, in people and all people, because Christ is head over all people. And Near Eastern pagan cultures long predated any Semitic Abrahamic religion to signify representation and sovereignty, a concept early Christian thinkers like Augustine and Victorianists adapted to describe humanity's unique spiritual relationship and dignity, not biblical. This is love of enemy. When I said love of enemy, universal dignity, conscience, he said this is why comparative religion is important, a largely universal concept. And then when I said the saying that the federal government lacks an official religion is not the same as saying American law, political thought, or moral assumptions were non-Christian. He says, and passing religious laws would establish a religion. And I said, authority is conditional, power is limited, rulers are accountable to a higher moral law, and government rests on mutual oaths rather than divine kinship or clerical rule. He said, and paganism was the same way until Christians showed up with the Norse jars were voted for, answered to the law speakers. Sorry, hold on. He said, and paganism was the same way until Christians showed up with the Norse jars were voted for, answered to the law speakers, which came from the people, who answered to the people, the priests and such could advise, but had no decision-making power. So he keeps telling me I need to do more research and all that. And I told him this, so you're just kind of laughed at him and says, you're restating prior points and pointing out atrocities in comparison to indigenous and pagan societies. What does this prove? Like what I'm saying, what I'm asking, proves what exactly other than moral cherry picking? And it says, looks like you're like all volume with no real substance, right? And so the declaration, God is a creator God. It's not neutral, otherwise it's polytheism. So what proof do you have that, what proof do you actually have that Christians cannot presuppose the Christian God in the declaration then, since it claims neither pagan nor Christian as far as creator God goes? And how does polytheism work within the declaration then? And then I said that the claim, when he said authority is conditional, power is limited, rulers are accountable to higher moral laws, and government rests on moral oaths rather than divine kingship. Paganism was the same way until Christians showed up, right? So when he quoted me and then I quoted him, when he says paganism was the same way until Christians showed up, right? So I said the difference is in scope, moral grounding, and universality. Christian covenantalism grounds authority in a moral order that applies universally. All humans bear the imago Dei, whereas pagan systems were often limited to elites or specific social classes. In a moral source in Christianity, rulers and citizens are accountable to God's covenant and moral law. In Norse systems, authority and accountability were primarily local, practical, and limited to the tribe or clan. There were no universal moral obligations or ethical accountability beyond the immediate society. Rights and equality, covenant theology in America provided moral justification for equality, resistance against tyranny, and the protection of the vulnerable, which pagan systems largely ignored. Example, Benjamin Bennett. Sorry, hold on. Examples, Benjamin Banneker enslaved African Americans, and radical Protestants grounded in egalitarian ideas and rights and biblical covenantal principles, not in pagan Norse, Greek, or Roman precedents. Even if some procedural similarities existed in pagan systems, the moral and universal framework that shaped American law is distinctly covenantal and Christian, not pagan. And I said, saying the U.S. federal government is secular in the sense that it has no official church does not negate the covenantal moral framework on which it is built. Federalism organizes power. It does not erase the Christian moral identity embedded in American law and civic thought. The separation of church and state was itself a tool to protect covenantal ethics from being corrupted by coercive ecclesiastical authority, not to remove morality from governance. And I asked him, do you even understand my position? I said, theists aren't Christians. And that's what I asked him. So apparently they can be when it comes to moral ethics, according to Jefferson. I sort of laughed at him, right? And also on your failure to also address the creator God presupposition, as I've asked. The term creator is not neutral in practice. While creator could theoretically refer to any deity in the context of the American founders and their writings, the term almost always invokes the God of the Bible, as the language and moral framework clearly align with biblical ethics. Jefferson, Adams, and others consistently link creator with law, covenant, and moral order, all hallmarks of Yahweh's revelation, not Zeus or other pagan gods. Presupposing the Christian God is not the same as polytheism. Christians and covenant-minded Americans are working from a specific moral and covenantal framework. Even if atheists or Enlightenment thinker uses creator generically, the functional influence in law, liberty, and rights is deeply Hebraic Christian, not pluralistic. Treating creator as entirely neutral, ignores historical context. Polytheism requires recognition of multiple divine authorities. The founders and the moral framework they drew from consistently assume a single sovereign moral lawgiver. That is not polytheism. It is a recognition that civil society rests on accountability to a higher singular moral authority. In short, if claiming the term creator could be anyone's God that doesn't erase the Christian Hebraic presuppositions embedded in American political thought. It's not about semantics, it's about moral and covenantal content, which is distinctly biblical. And I said also to substantiate my claims on even Christianized theists like Jefferson operating within a covenantal Christian moral view from his second inaugural address. And Jefferson said, I shall need to the favor of that being in whose hands we are, who led our fathers as Israel of old, right? The Pilgrim Fathers were also covenant-minded people, right? And this has to do with identity, a covenant identity, which also ties into covenant principles and stuff like that, of a chosen nation, being led by God and chosen people, things like that, from their native land and planted them in a country flowing with all the necessaries and comforts of life, who has covered our infancy with his providence and our riper years with his wisdom and power, and to whose goodness I ask you to join with me in supplications, right? End quote. And this line anchors Jefferson's thinking in a biblical framework, not merely abstract deism. Even if Jefferson personally held unorthodox theological views compared to traditional Christianity, as many historians note, here he deliberately evokes the biblical narrative of Israel, the story of God, guiding a people through a covenant journey, and applies it as an analogy for the American experience. Biblical typology noticed by the founders. The use of as Israel of old isn't random. It's a direct typological comparison to the Exodus narrative. The story is central to Jewish and Christian covenant theology. God calling a people, binding them in covenant, and guiding them through towards freedom and law. Jefferson's rhetoric reflects that symbolic worldview, showing that the moral imagination of the era leaned on biblical themes, covenantal imagery, not just generic deism. Historians often distinguish between strict deism, a generic belief in an impersonal creator who does not intervene, in biblical covenantalism as an active providential God who engages with a people. Jefferson's reference blends both. He acknowledges a guiding providence in history and associates it with the biblical God who led Israel as a political message in 1805 that would have been understood by the audience in biblical, not merely abstract philosophical terms. Supports a covenant interpretation of federalism and identity. By invoking the Exodus motive, Jefferson participates in a Hebraic political imagination in which a people see their founding as under divine guidance. Law and liberty are seen not just as human inventions, but as grounded in a moral order. The nation's identity is wrapped in a chosen people narrative similar to ancient Israel. This fits with scholars like Aaron Shalev in American Zion, who show that early Americans often understood their political project using biblical political imagery. And also on your remark on Jefferson not being serious about his claims to follow Jesus, if we can't trust the founders' statements about their religious beliefs because they were personally heterodox, then why should we trust their claims about secularism or the separation of church and state? Their writings consistently show a reliance on moral law, covenantal principles, and God-given rights as the foundation of government. Picking and choosing which statements to trust undermines you. Either the founders' moral framework is meaningful, or it isn't, and their moral framework is deeply biblical. Or it isn't. Either it's meaningful or it's not. Either you can trust what they say or you can't, right? And also their moral framework is deeply biblical. I would also add, what proof do you have that the founders cared about secularism and not just like federalism, since those two things aren't the same thing, right? And then I did more research, right? So I was reading from the books that I had, and I said that, like I said, here's a quote from Joe Barlow from his writings called Advice to the Privileged Order, the actual author of the Treaty of Tripoli, the Tripoli Treaty, right? And it says, which once again backs up what I've been arguing. He said in the book Advice to the Privileged Order by Joe Barlow, from the association of ideas that usually, he said, from the association of ideas that usually connects the church with religion, they may run the risk of being misunderstood by some readers, unless I advertise them that I consider no connection as existing between these two subjects. And where I speak of church indefinitely, I mean the government of a state, assuming the name of God to govern by divine authority, or in other words, darkening the consciousness of men in order to oppress them in the United States of America. There is no such thing as a church, and yet in no country are the people more religious. And I said that there is no government-sanctioned church, so that the state does not claim divine authority to govern. People are still highly religious. Religion exists in personal and civic life without being enforced as law. When he mentions church in the context of an establishment, he means any government that claims divine authority to coerce conscience, not Christianity or religion in general. So this fits with how the Treaty of Tripoli, 1797, is often read, that the government asserts it will not establish a state church or enforce religion while citizens remain free to practice faith. Federalism is a covenant structure as the Declaration and Constitution, none of which presupposes this secular morality absent of religious foundation. This person said, and if you knew anything about other religions, Norse and Greek, or for example, which I don't have to know any of that in order to understand my country as a religious nation, or even distinctly a Christian nation, right? Have an ultimate creator above the pantheon or whatever. And I said, he just has one guy. I quoted more than one founder, and you quote one guy, really? I'm like, I just laughed at him. I said, quote whatever you like, it won't prove anything. Yeah, and that's like bizarre, because the one thing, like one of the main things they depend on is the Treaty of Tripoli. And I said, yeah, and I quoted, this is the treaty that a lot of these founders signed, right? Like it was in the draft of George Washington's, what he approved of, right? And John Adams signed it, right? And I said, none of them are even presupposing the secular idea that this guy and secularists are thinking of, right? That the treaty itself, neither do the writers and the ones who signed it, none of them agree with you on anything. And he said, quoting, the people actually involved in the creation of the nation carried far more weight than some guy from after the fact. So now he goes against the Treaty of Tripoli, right? Even though the ones actually, the founders, right, like I said, they also signed the treaty. So I thought that should add some weight to it. It just doesn't support you, what you're saying. This is, so I was laughed at him. So you want to reduce this to quotes, all of which, both good and bad, when he spoke of Christianity, obviously isn't all under one definition of Christianity. Like I just showed you that with the author of the Treaty of Tripoli, which the founders included John Adams, right, signed. So no way you're just saying we just have to quote the founders themselves, but he's not even interpreting them correctly. And he says, if I wanted to do that, that's all I would have posted. All you're doing is straw man, whataboutism, nuh-uh. Okay, whatever. He says the overwhelming consensus, historical, legal, constitutional, says you're wrong, right? Says I'm wrong. Even the overwhelming consensus of biblical scholars, I linked to videos from on in another comment, says you are wrong. I didn't see the link or whatever. It says all you video is what? On my video, it says it's conspiracy theory built on assumptions and conjecture. Speaking of atoms, he says it's too late in the day for man of sincerity to pretend they believe in the Platonic mysticisms and that three are one, and when you get the Trinity thing, because they don't like the Trinity, right? The founders. And yet, but even Jefferson tolerated, like, yeah, he would still wish, like, goodwill towards Trinitarians, Unitarians, and stuff like that. And have in that book on the quotations of the founders that I mentioned, it goes over all of that. And then, where was I? Yeah, Platonic mysticisms, that three are one and one is three, and yet the one is not three and the three are not one. To divide mankind by a single letter into co-substantialists and like substantialists. Yeah, the whole debate on the Trinity, or the old church history debate that I mentioned a lot in my previous videos on the two natures, the co-substantial and all that stuff. This isn't that creed, Nicene Creed. Co-substantial with us, co-substantial with the Father, or whatever. And he says, but this constitutes the craft, the power, and the profit of the priests. Yeah, that's the quote. Sweep away their gossamer fabrics of fictitious religion, and they would catch no more flies. We should all then, like the Quakers, live without an order of priests, moralize for ourselves, follow the oracle conscience, and they and say nothing about what no man can understand, nor therefore believe, for I suppose belief to be the assent of the mind to an intelligible proposition, right? But dissenting Christians, like the Quakers, like is one of the Christian orders that they favored, because obviously they didn't like the sort of Anglican type or the Catholic or the Orthodox type with the imperial national ecclesiastical religion, right? So that's what I'm saying. Like these skeptics or secularists, they treat all Christianity like it's the same, and it's not all the same. And then Jefferson's letter to John Adams, right? And I read that one already. Said this other one is again to John Adams. The day would come when mystical generations of Jesus by the Supreme Being as his Father in the womb of a virgin would be classified with the fable of the generation of Minerva and the brain of Jupiter. But we may hope that the dawn of reason and freedom of thought in these United States would do away with all this artificial scaffolding and restore to us the primitive ingenious doctrines of the most venerated reformer of human errors. And then John Adams to John Taylor. The priesthood have in all ancient nations nearly monopolized learning, and ever since the Reformation, when or where has existed a Protestant or dissenting sect who would tolerate a free inquiry, the blackest Billingsgate, the most ungentlemanly insolence, the most Yahooishly brutality as impatient. What Protestant dissenting would tolerate a free inquiry? Okay, but then just list the Quakers or so. Anyway, but touch a solemn truth in collision with a dogma of a sect, though capable of the clearest proof, and you will find you have disturbed a nest, and the hornets will swarm about your eyes and hand, and fly into your face and eyes. John Adams' letter to John Taylor. And then this one is, the United States of America have exhibited perhaps the first example of governments erected on the simple principles of nature, and if men are now sufficiently enlightened to disabuse themselves of artifice, imposture, hypocrisy, and superstition, they would consider this event as an era in their history, although the detail of the formation of the American governments is at present little known or regarded either in Europe or in America. It may hereafter become an object of curiosity. It will never be pretended that any persons employed in that service had interviews with the gods or were in any degree under the influence of heaven more than those at work upon ships or houses or laboring in merchandise or agriculture. It will forever be acknowledged that these governments were contrived merely by the use of reason and the senses. John Adams' defense of the constitutions of the government of the United States, 1787 to 1788. I told him that the founders rejected priestcraft and metaphysics precisely because they believed political authority must be morally accountable under a higher law, which is a fundamentally biblical covenantal idea, not a pagan one. These quotes do not contradict the covenantal or biblical moral foundation for America and for American political thought. They reinforced it. Said governments erected on the simple principles of nature, Adams 1814. Adams is not appealing to paganism or secular relativism. By nature, Adams means natural law, a moral order that judges rulers and binds conscience. I'm sorry, my dog's barking. Adams repeatedly grounded natural law in a creator and moral governor, not in materialism or pagan myth. Adams elsewhere explicitly says that our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. So nature here means moral order, accessible to reason, not atheism, polytheism, or pagan ritual, criticisms of priesthoods and organized religion. Adams and Jefferson consistently opposed priestly domination, corruption, and alliances with despots, something the Hebrew prophets themselves condemn. This is not anti-biblical, it's biblical. Elijah versus Baal priests, Jeremiah versus temple elites, Jesus versus Pharisaic authority, Paul versus Judaizing control. Opposing priestcraft does not equal rejecting biblical covenantal morality. It says too late in the day for Platonic mysticism, Jefferson 1814. Jefferson is rejecting Greek metaphysics, not biblical ethics. Jefferson explicitly contrasts Platonic abstraction with the moral teachings of Jesus. That is why he says he is a Christian. He says, I am a Christian in the only sense he wished anyone to be sincerely attached to his doctrines. Rejecting Platonic mysticism. Yeah, rejecting Platonic mysticism actually moves Jefferson closer to Hebraic moral realism, not paganism, right? So his points are not actually proven anything. And I want to go over the other secularists I was arguing with. So I'm just seeing if this guy's going to reply. But I want to go over to see what the other replies are, from the other one I was arguing with. See if there's any actual, substance or, to their position. Okay, this other one. There's one Christian said our Constitution was made for immoral, religious people, right? It's totally inadequate to any others, according to John Adams, right? Other people respond to him, and one guy says Epicurean philosophers, the Stoics, the Cynics, many Buddhists, modern day humanists, Jeremy Bentham, Immanuel Kant, John Rawls, and better thinkers than you, too numerous to list, all respectfully beg to differ. How even the Satanic Temple does a better and more coherent job than you do, laying out and aspires to objective moral code. That's what I mean. It's like everything but Christian, right? But Christianity is like, that's what I told you. How are you an ally at all? Like you're not. Like you're opposed to us. That's why it's necessary to smash the secular ideology. All they've ever done is try to substitute Christianity with something else. Substitute something else for Christianity, thinking they could find something better. And I mean, they pretty much failed at that experiment. This is why I'm trying to basically remove the presupposition, the secular presupposition. Like, I think secularism can be complementary, but not as a foundation, as something else. Maybe it answers a different set of questions, right? So it could be useful some other way, but it's absolutely not what defines us as a people. I think the covenant presupposition fills that. So, like here, I'll just start here, right? Because I argued with this person and other places, right? And here's like at the very top, which is easier to find the comments, right? Because the other ones got entangled or so, other people's conversations. And so I responded to him. I said, Lucretius is nature without obligation. Kant is duty without judge. Rawls is fairness without truth. Basically, they're useful for critique, but useless for foundations. That's why revolutions grounded purely in Enlightenment rationalism, France, USSR, collapsed into terror, while Anglo-American constitutionalism endured. Listing Epicureans, Stoics, Buddhists, Kant, Rawls, or even the Satanic Temple does not answer the question at issue. The question is not whether non-Christians can behave morally. History proves they can. The question is what grounds moral obligation, accountability, and political authority. None of the systems you named provide binding moral law. They describe ethical preferences, procedural fairness, or utility, but they cannot explain why injustice deserves judgment, why rulers are accountable, or why law stands above power. Covenantal morality is categorically different. It grounds law and oath, accountability, and a moral order that judges rulers as well as citizens. That is why constitutionalism, federalism, and rights emerged historically in covenantal cultures and not merely in philosophical ones. Enumerating philosophers is not an argument. Explaining moral authority is. He says, well, you have a lot of self-serving, as we said to me, he says, well, you have a lot of self-serving and celestial North Korea serving rationalizations, evidently, but no persuasive case to make any thinking person. You may want to reflect and ponder why that is. Okay? It gives me this link. This is both of you and the celestial North Korea. Both of you and Filmer undoubtedly would feel right at home. And an autocratic tyranny, peddling fictions about purportedly objective morality being found in the arbitrary pronouncements of the man behind the curtain purporting to speak for this, like the pyrotechnic wizard that doesn't exist, But the genius of American constitutionalism, which has been emulated and sometimes improved upon in many countries, is and has been throwing off the control freak fictions of both monarchists and Filmer. You could not possibly misunderstand reality more than you do, caged in by false and absurd beliefs the way you are. It says vastly more persuasive than you are on the subject of how thinking people of good conscience can distinguish moral and immoral. It says maybe try it, rather than being a servile, credulous, toady, pathetic and obsequious toward the vile, manipulative humans who employ religious fictions to get you and others like you to commit atrocities. I'm just trying to laugh at them because it's ridiculous. And okay, it says told me to cope, and self-delusion is strong in this one. Assume that the Assyrian Empire were acting under the sincere belief that their genocide plus ethnic cleansing of the northern kingdom was commanded by none other than Ashur. Objectively moral. How about the cleaning of Judea by Babylon and the ensuing Babylonian captivity? If they sincerely believed Marduk is real and Marduk commanded it, objectively moral. If the fictional war and storm god Yahweh actually, rather than fictionally, commanded or was sincerely believed to have done so, genocide and ethnic cleansing against Amalek, the Amalekites, against Moab, the Moabites, against the human and the even animal inhabitants of Jericho and other human communities in and around Mesopotamia, objectively moral, or obviously and flagrantly the opposite of moral. Please elaborate on how you objectively distinguish immoral, slavery, rape, genocide, ethnic cleansing from moral. Is there any rhyme or reason at all in your incoherent mental gymnastics? So you're just awfully insulting me a lot, right? Not really, just giving me the same old ridiculous, immoral objections, right? As if that's all Christianity has ever been, immoral, right? And it's like, okay, and I said, you're complaining three things. And pretending they are the same. Belief that a God commanded something, claim that something is objectively moral. Whether humans correctly interpret a command, those are not identical, and every serious moral philosophy, religious or secular, recognizes that distinction. If you collapse them, all moral systems fail, including Kant, Rawls, Bentham, Buddhism, Stoicism, and humanism. And if morality is merely emergent, socially constructed, and contingent on human societies, then genocide is only locally immoral, not objectively wrong. On your view, Assyria wasn't wrong, they just had a different moral ecosystem. If morality is objective, then genocide can be condemned regardless of belief. If morality is emergent, genocide is just how that society functioned. And whatever someone thinks God commanded is automatically moral, right? That's what he said. It says God's nature is the good, and moral commands flow from that nature. Human interpretation is fallible. Claims of divine command are subject to moral coherence, revelation, and context. That's why false prophets are condemned, kings are judged, Israel itself is punished for injustice. If divine command were to, do whatever you think God says, which is what he was implying, the Bible itself would be incoherent like you. Is genocide objectively wrong everywhere, or only where societies decide it is? Once again, your argument collapses because you confuse belief, authority, and morality. If morality is emergent and contingent, then genocide is not objectively wrong. Then it's only locally disapproved of. That destroys your ability to condemn Assyria, Babylon, or anyone else. If morality is objective, then appeals to what people believe God commanded are irrelevant. Belief does not determine moral truth. Biblical moral judgment is covenantal, accountable, and even condemns Israel itself, unlike pagan divine violence, which serves power without moral constraint. Name-dropping Kant, Rawls, Bentham, or Buddhism does not solve the grounding problem. They assume moral value. They do not explain why it binds universally. You are borrowing objective moral standards to attack deism, while denying the very foundation that makes those standards meaningful. It just gives me this, told me just want to ignore the wall of text that I have no clue. that your morality is anything but. Morality is something that human societies do or sometimes don't do very well, like Mesopotamia, harem keeping, goat herders, prophets, and aspiring emperors did the exact opposite. Not something that imposed exogenously from an imaginary celestial throne. All gods, more than 5,000 of them, are fictional and no more real than leprechauns, fairies, dragons, the jinn, or the ghost. Get over it, and yours is among the worst of those grossly immoral, bloodthirsty, fictional, supernatural inventions. Goodbye, I'm reclaiming my time because you are offering nothing of value, just the same scripted of other fools, blah, blah, whatever. I said, you're not even serious. And he says, tell me this. I don't know, he says, ignorance and muted. I don't know. And then, I tell him that your argument keeps shifting categories, and that's the core problem. Like you appeal to Norse, Pagan, Epicurean, Stoic, Buddhists, or modern secular moral systems. That does not refute covenantal influence on America. It only shows that moral overlap exists across cultures. Overlap does not explain historical transmission, institutional form, or political structure. The question is not, do other cultures have morals? The question is, which moral framework actually shaped Anglo-American political thought, legal vocabulary, and constitutional architecture? That record overwhelmingly runs through Hebraic covenant to Reformed political theology to English descent to colonial America. Claiming morality is merely an emergent social phenomenon, right, which is what he said in the other post he was arguing with me on. This destroys your own position. If morality is purely contingent, then you have no basis to condemn genocide, slavery, or religious coercion at all, only to say you personally dislike them. Yet you repeatedly invoke moral outrage as if it carries objective weight. You are borrowing moral authority while denying its foundation. That is incoherent. Invoking Lucretius, Epicurus, Kant, Rawls, Bentham, or even the Satanic Temple does not solve the problem of moral grounding. Kant's categorical imperative assumes the intrinsic worth of persons but cannot justify why persons have worth. Rawls presupposes moral intuitions he does not generate. Bentham reduces morality to utility, which historically justifies atrocities whenever the greater good demanded it. None of these systems explain why moral obligations bind universally rather than socially, and your genocide hypotheticals misunderstand classical deism. Biblical moral realism is not divine command theory in the caricatured sense you keep attacking. God does not define good arbitrarily. He commands in accordance with his nature, which grounds objective moral order. Historical judgments in ancient Near Eastern warfare are descriptive claims within specific covenantal contexts, not transferable moral licenses. By contrast, if morality is socially emergent, as you claim, then Assyria, Babylon, and any society acting within its norms cannot be morally condemned at all. You have eliminated moral judgment entirely. Nature's God does not exclude Yahweh simply because the declaration of voice sectarian, because he was saying the same dumb thing, that nature's God cannot be the biblical God or whatever, even though the entire structure and presuppositions and all of that is dependent upon it. And nature's God does not exclude Yahweh simply because the declaration avoids sectarian language. That is a category error. Political documents aimed at plural publics routinely use natural law language precisely because it was already understood as compatible with biblical deism. Locke, Blackstone, Adams, Wilson, and Jefferson himself all explicitly tie natural law to the God of Scripture elsewhere. Silence is not denial. Prudence is not deception. The Constitution lacking explicit theological language does not prove secularism. Federalism is a structural covenant, not an ecclesiastical hierarchy. That distinction was made by dissenting Christians, not Enlightenment secularists. Separation of church and state was designed to protect religious conscience from state coercion, not to expel Christianity from moral authority. The Treaty of Tripoli addresses jurisdictional non-establishment, not metaphysical neutrality. Calling objective morality totalitarian fraud, which is what he said in the other post that he made when we were arguing. I said, calling objective morality, totalitarian fraud, while appealing to justice, human dignity, oppression, genocide, and rights is self-defeating. Those concepts only make sense if moral truths transcend societies. You are standing on borrowed capital, using covenantal moral assumptions while denying their source. You have shown that morality exists cross-culturally. You have not shown that American political identity is pagan, Epicurean, or secular in origin, and you have not provided a coherent alternative that you can actually condemn the evils you invoke. And he says, I see you're still propagating nonsense and still relying on strawman paraphrastic fallacies, ignoring the deist, Enlightenment, and Freemason and perspectives that predominated in 1787 to 91, especially among participants in the 1787 convention, in favor of your phony crap in retconning narrative is just silly. Yet deists and Freemason and whatever, like, they don't actually presuppose this secular ideology. In fact, I think from what I've read, it's almost, it is, what is the word, anachronistic. Well, you're reading the modern concept of secularism back into the founding, which is not at all what they presupposed. And then, what do you say? So the whole point is that the founders themselves were emphatic that the U.S. federal government formed in June 1788. Jefferson was not present in 1787 through 88, as he was busy penning a letter to his nephew, Peter Carr, that you ought to read, on his way to France, among other things, is inclusive of all those global religious perspectives. It does not favor any Christian sect or over Mohammedan or Hindu perspectives, and that is reinforced because the losing in votes anti-federalists lost their effing minds about the godless constitution being ratified. Again, they lost. In reality, over anti-federalist opposition, the godless constitution advocated by Madison was ratified. Same Madison who later set every new and successful example, therefore, of a perfect separation between ecclesiastical and civil matters is of importance, and I have no doubt that every new example will succeed as every past one has done, in showing that religion and government will both exist in greater purity, unless they are mixed together. We are teaching the world the great truth that government do better without kings and nobles than with them. The merit will be doubled by the other lesson, that religion flourishes in greater purity without than with the aid of government. He was obviously corrected then and remains correct today. And you likewise conveniently forget the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, in which both Madison and Jefferson had a hand, introduced in 1779 and then finally passed in 1786, just a little over 1 year before 1787. Over 1 year before the convention commenced. Not to mention Madison's memorial and remonstrance, the actions of key founders are completely inconsistent with the phony and fictional narrative that Christian nationalists peddle about any intention of those writings or ratifying the Constitution to base it on elevating Christian religion over any other religious perspective, including deism or no religion at all, which are also equal and equality-based secular society. Also, to drive the point home that you are spectacularly ignorant of the history of the founding period, the election of 1800 became a referendum on religion and government, according to the newspaper at the time. The Great Question stated, says, and the present solemn and momentous epoch, the only question to be asked by every American laying his hand on his heart is, shall I continue allegiance to God and a religious president, John Adams, or impiously declare for Jefferson and no God? The result, Jefferson attacked as atheist. Whether or not he was atheist, won the popular vote against the religious president by nearly 2-1 margin. Landslide victory for a non-Christian nation, but inclusive and secular one, in which all religions and non-religious people are all equally welcome perspective. So you're welcome to apologize for your silly and historical and misrepresentations about what the founders, aside from the losers of multiple votes, were really up to in the period of 1787 to 1808. You can include 1808 through 1816 if you think that Madison's presidency counts too. And QED, aside from graciously accepting your apology, I prefer not to interact with you and your nonsense again. Learn some history in the world, and more history, world history and American history, I guess, as well as philosophy, pal. And so to refute all of his nonsense, right? Especially on the equality of the religions and all that, I quoted him Joseph's Story. Joseph's Story, I said to him, Joseph's Story, he was chosen by Madison. He wrote the definitive early constitutional commentary. His work was widely cited by courts and lawyers in the 19th century. Story explicitly rejects the idea that the Constitution was hostile to Christianity. Right? Even Madison and the other poets that showed to him that Madison and the rest of the founders believed that in the aid of providence, even in that convention, right, the Constitutional Convention mentions several of them. I made a short video on it, having other quotes. The finger of God, right? All those kind of things, all those references. So it's not at all like a godless constitution. Silence does not mean absence, right? That's like a fallacy. And this, anyway, like when I was saying that it's from the commentaries on the Constitution of the United States, 1833, Book 3, 1871, right? And then so Story said that the real object of the amendment was not to countenance, much less to advance Mohammedanism or Judaism or infidelity by prostrating Christianity, but to exclude all rivalry among Christian sects and to prevent any national ecclesiastical establishment. Also, Story explicitly warns against indifference to religion because indifference leads to hostility. From 1874, he said, "The duty of government is not indifference, which would create a general disapprobation or distrust of all religions, but to leave religion where the Constitution has left it, to the support of private judgment and voluntary choice." James Madison appointed Joseph Story, whose authoritative constitutional commentary explicitly denies that the First Amendment was intended to prostrate Christianity or advance infidelity. Story affirms that separation of church and state was designed to prevent sectarian coercion while preserving Christianity as the moral foundation of the Republic. This directly refutes claims that the Constitution was godless, secularist, or religiously indifferent. Joel, Barlow, Jefferson, Madison, deists, Masons, etc. Nobody favors your secularism. You are confusing institutional non-establishment with moral secularism. The Treaty of Tripoli denied the U.S. was a Christian state church waging religious war. Not that American law, political theory, or moral assumptions were non-Christian. That interpretation collapses under Joseph Story, a Supreme Court justice appointed by Madison himself, right? So he explicitly said the Constitution did not prostrate Christianity, but merely prevented rivalry among Christian sects. Madison argued for a separation to protect religion from corruption, not to create a morally neutral state. The Constitution presupposes oaths, covenantal consent, moral accountability, and fixed human nature. All who break Christian concepts, a government can be non-ecclesiastical without being secular. America was covenantal, not confessional, and that distinction is precisely what your argument keeps missing. Try to find the other post that we made. Now over here, he said that the Declaration is subtle political rhetoric from beginning to end, and the word nature very similar to Lear's oath to nature in Act 1 of King Lear. Does a lot of heavy lifting. There's a reason why people like you fixate inappropriately on the 1776 Declaration, because the word God is completely absent on purpose from the 1787 Constitution that Madison drafted. Go look for yourself, right? I'm going to say that the Declaration loses its normative force, and founding oaths become meaningless, and appeals to higher law are incoherent. At that point, your position is not historical. It's almost like an ideological skepticism. I said that the Declaration is just subtle political rhetoric, right? What he said. I said that this assumes without proof that references to nature, providence, creator, supreme judge, and divine protection are empty metaphors. That's an interpretive imposition, not historical analysis. The founders themselves rejected that reading. James Madison, 1787 Constitutional Convention. He says, "It is impossible for the man of pious reflection not to perceive in it a finger of that almighty hand." George Washington, first inaugural, says, quote, "No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States." Declaration itself appeals to a transcendent moral authority that judges kings, a biblical idea, not a pagan one. Calling this mere rhetoric is special pleading. When founders speak against priestcraft, skeptics treat their words as sincere. When founders invoke God and providence, skeptics suddenly call it a metaphor, or call it metaphor. You can't have it both ways. And I said, if I understand Lear invokes nature emotionally and consistently, from what I've looked up, right? I said the Declaration invokes nature and nature's God as a source of objective moral law that judges political power. Jefferson himself distinguished between poetic, rhetoric, and natural law reasoning. The Declaration's language mirrors Locke, Grotius, Pufendorf, Blackstone, and colonial covenant documents, not Shakespearean drama. He said, he responded to me, he said, here also was not Christian. The whole point of here, near nature, here, there, God is here, was to emphasize the pre-Christian culture of the legendary Lear. To anyone in the know about alternatives to Christianity, Jefferson had 5 copies of Lucretius at a time when books were as pricey as automobiles are pricey today. The word nature in the Declaration was like a klaxon saying, this document is written to 2 audiences, the rubes who will misunderstand it as pandering to Christianity versus those in the know who can understand what we're really saying. You're really that dense. Keep desperately trying to rationalize. If the founders actually meant Adonai or Jehovah of the Old Testament, it would have been easy enough to word it in that way. Sorry. And he says, nature's God does not equal Adonai, tetragrammaton of the Old Testament. You do as poorly with great literature as you do with law and government to the most traditional of Christian minds, not to the philosophers or thinkers you reference, or for instance, and certainly not Spinoza, who are all a lot more like Jefferson than you realize. Nature's God is a heresy of the highest order, subtly concealed in plain sight, but the words actually used unmistakably are intended to be not Ixian, not Trinitarian, and not Abrahamic. If you actually pay close attention to the word choice, he gives me a dumb video, but anyway, and he says, also human morality cannot possibly ever be objective in that sense that C is constant everywhere in the universe and the fine structure constant never varies. Morality is an emergent phenomenon happening within different human societies. You see, this is where he was like trying to make this dumb argument. They converge to a large degree, but not perfectly. And in the absence of living things, conditions that predominate throughout the cosmos, morality is completely irrelevant. What is objective morality? As applied to a Stygodiferous linetus spider or a Glyptopantylus, right? Glyptopantylus wasp. A wasp. As I said, these people like use the most bizarre examples. Authoritarian delusional wordplay about purportedly objective morality is completely invalid, gaslighting, and this is horseshit. And then I responded with, that your claims collapse under a basic category error that objective morality does not mean applies to every entity in the universe, like a physical constant. That's a misunderstanding of what objective means in philosophy. Mathematical truths are objective but don't apply to rocks. Logical laws are objective but don't apply to spiders. Moral truths are objective within the domain of moral agents, being capable of rational choice, intention, and responsibility. Insects are not moral agents. Bringing up spiders and parasitic wasps is a red herring, not an argument. Morality is normative, not descriptive. It concerns what ought to be, not what is. Demanding that morality behave like this fine structure constant is like asking for the molecule. Insects are not moral agents. Bringing up spiders and parasitic wasps is a red herring, not an argument. Morality is normative, not descriptive. It concerns what ought to be, not what is. Demanding that morality behave like the fine structure constant is like asking for the molecular weight of justice. It's a category mistake. Calling morality emergent doesn't help you either. Language, mathematics, and law are emergent too, yet they can still be objective and binding. Emergence explains origins, not validity. Lastly, moral relativism defeats itself. If morality is merely social convergence, then slavery, genocide, and rape are never truly wrong, only cultural disfavored. Yet you still condemn them as actually evil. That contradiction shows you're borrowing objective moral language while denying its foundation. Morality does not need to govern spiders or exist in lifeless space to be objective. It only needs to bind moral agents, and it does. Said that Christian theologians had used God of nature or for centuries. Aquinas, Hooker, Calvin, and Reformed natural law traditions, right? Like even Calvin was from very early on, right? They used to have a book on Calvin. It's Humanism, I think it was called. Goes over his early, like his Renaissance education or something, right? And so to claim traditional Christianity, also based off Reformed natural law traditions, right? So to claim that traditional Christianity, view this as a heresy, is simply false. It also depends what Christian tradition and which church is the Church of America like to have such authority to condemn it as such, right? And nature's God was not a rejection of the God of Scripture. It was a juridical and philosophical designation used in natural law discourse overwhelmingly by Christians to describe the same God known through general revelation rather than special revelation. You deny objective morality while making moral indictments, deny the biblical God while invoking providence, and deny Christianity's influence while relying on its moral vocabulary. Your position only works by borrowing what it claims to reject. And then he says, quite the contrary, it is you who is mistaken. That's what he told me. And it's like all rhetoric about purportedly objective morality is a totalitarian fraud, especially when combined, as you knuckle draggers inevitably do, with divine command theory, which is the exact opposite in practice of any morality at all. Perhaps take the time to learn about Immanuel Kant, categorical, imperative, and moral philosophy subsequent to Kant. You have literally nothing persuasive to say to any thinking person, right? I told him that the phrase nature's God was not a code word for paganism or Lucretian materialism in 18th century Anglo-American usage. It was a standard Protestant Enlightenment formulation rooted in natural law theology, not Epicurean atheism. Locke, Grotius, Pufendorf, Samuel Clarke, and Blackstone all freely use God of nature, author of nature, or nature's God, while explicitly affirming the biblical God. It has to be like a word concept fallacy, right, with these people. That nature's God cannot be the biblical God or something. It must imply some other God, like a deist God or something. And then it's like, Anglican sermons routinely spoke of the laws of nature's God, the God who governs nature and nations. This language was especially common among anti-establishment Protestants who rejected ecclesiastical mediation, but not Christian theism. They rejected ecclesiastical meditation, but not Christian theism. In other words, nature's God doesn't equal anti-Christian. It means the Creator is like as knowable through moral order, not a denial of revelation. The King Lear analogy fails because Shakespeare's Lear is pre-Christian mythal poetry, not political theory. Jefferson was writing a public, legal, political justification, not dramatic literature. There is zero documentary evidence Jefferson intended a wink-wink pagan subtext, right? And that two audiences claim is speculation masquerading as insight. He says, and yet the Declaration was written by Jefferson, who collected copies of Lucretius' De Rerum Natura. Lucretius wrote prior to any of those, and who painstakingly excised miracles and deistic claims from the New Testament. You may be accustomed to talking to ignorant, credulous rubes, but please don't assume I'm one of you. And he says, I mean that in 1600 February, Giordano Bruno was burned alive for precisely such heresies. He, like Jefferson and Paine and some others you've heard of in the founding period, also thought highly of Lucretius. That's when I said, when he said objective morality is totalitarian fraud, I said, this is philosophical posturing, not argument. If morality is merely emergent, there is no moral basis to condemn slavery, no grounds to judge tyranny, no reason rights are unalienable, no reason injustice is wrong rather than undesirable. The Declaration collapses entirely without objective moral truth. Kant does not help you with Kant presupposes objective moral obligation. Kant grounded morality in rational necessity, not social preference. Kant's ethics will still require universality, which contradicts moral relativism. Calling objective morality of authoritarian is ironic. Relativism always collapses, right? It's ironic that relativism always collapses into power deciding morality. And I said, whether modern Christians approve of the definition of Christian, right, is irrelevant to 18th century political meaning, because Jefferson, he rejected Trinitarian metaphysics, ecclesiastical authority, clerical coercion. He didn't reject Jesus as moral teacher, biblical moral law, providence judging nations, Christianity as the moral foundation of republicanism. Jefferson explicitly said that I am a real Christian, that is to say, disciple of the doctrines of Jesus, like what Jesus actually taught, not what they claim because it seems like they claim that Jefferson is rationalizing Jesus or something, but no, he's talking about what Jesus actually taught, the pure teachings of Christ, the true teachings of Christ, what he claims to be a disciple of, which has to do with the moral essence of his covenant, right, which is this moral covenant theology, which he's clearly trying to, I guess he's articulating it through what it says in this Jefferson Bible, which is properly called Life and Morals of Jesus. And so, yeah, so just I told him that if you actually read the Jefferson's Bible, it is in the title, The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. It is the essence of Christ's moral covenant theology. Yeah, because Jesus, right, basically, the New Testament can also be called the New Covenant, right? You cannot understand Jesus apart from his covenantal understanding, right? His religious presuppositions, because he's a religious Jew, right? And so you cannot rationalize away his, not just because they think that because he takes out these miracles. That's no, he's trying to I don't know how to say it. I'm sorry, I'm tired. He's trying to understand the moral essence of the whole thing to avoid sectarianism, right? And to strip away all the imperial constructs of the imperial church, right? With the Nicene presuppositions and all that, the consubstantiality, right? And I said it's the essence of Christ's moral covenant theology, which is the kingdom principles, or the gospel of the kingdom, basically. You're misunderstanding what kind of document the Declaration is. The Declaration is a public covenantal justification addressed to the opinions of mankind, written in the Law of Nations tradition. That genre never invokes sectarian theology, even when written by Christians. Jefferson himself explained that the Declaration expressed the common sense of the subject and the harmonizing sentiments of the day. And those sentiments were providence, moral accountability, natural law, higher judgment over rulers, all of which were biblical inherited concepts in the Anglo-American political thought. And I said that, they thought highly of Lucretius, they thought highly of many things. Jefferson read Lucretius, Cicero, Locke, who is Christian, right? Locke is Christian and against atheism, is one of his heroes, right? Also heavily influenced by Jesus, right? And the moral covenant idea, or basically what Jesus says, the summation of the whole law. Love God, love thy neighbor as yourself, right? Locke emphasizes that a lot. This is why I say it's very influenced, Lockean Christianity is very influential to the American founding, right? Not just dissenting Christianity or covenant theology, right? And I said that, he also read Newton, Bacon, and Scripture constantly, common law, Protestant moral theology. And so no serious historian claims that Jefferson's political theology can be reduced to one pagan poet, right? Which is what this guy is trying to do. And pretty sure that's all the exchanges that ties into what I've the earlier post that I was arguing with the same guy here. It's pretty much the exchange, and just wanted to see what your thoughts are, and the problems. I don't know. Maybe I guess I should put it into the chat, right, to review these exchanges. What can it sees, right? Because there's definitely a ton of fallacies and It, obviously, it's, how do I say it? Sorry, I'm trying to think because I've been reading all day. Yeah, hold on, let me just put it through. I wanted a review, right? Analysis of like all this, of what the chat thinks. You can review the exchanges and any problems that it can see, right? Any fallacies. It says, got it. Here's a review and analysis of your exchanges so far, and a broader take on the concept of the American covenant as an interpretive framework for understanding the grounding, right? I guess I also wanted to compare it to the vision that I believe God has given me. And it's also based on, obviously, the scholarly and academic books that I've been reading to put it together, and the chat has helped it, flesh it out. I'm trying to materialize that reality, right? How it all ties together. Like, what does it mean to be an American covenant nation, right? So I'm trying to compare it to this secular ideology and their pagan ideology, or their interpretive frames. That's basically what it is. All this is just basically arguing interpretive frames, but I believe mine is grounded in history and the American reality and the American lived experience, right? So it says, one, review of exchanges with the skeptics, a recurring pattern and fallacies. It says, one, origin fallacy and genetic fallacy. Skeptics like Carrier and your current interlocutors frequently argue, like it says, if an idea existed in pagan antiquity, then it cannot be Christian or covenanted in America. And this is a classic example. This is a classic genetic fallacy. The historical origin of an idea doesn't determine its meaning, adoption, or moral content in a new context. Sorry, I'll try to speak clearly. I'm just getting tired, that's all. It says your counter Christians and Americans reinterpreted ideas, republicanism, separation of powers, equality, through a covenantal moral and theological lens, given them new significance. 2, selective evidence, straw man of religious influence. They quote Jefferson, Madison, or Adams, emphasizing deism, secular rationalism, or criticisms of priesthood as proof that America was secular or pagan. This ignores the broader moral culture in which these thinkers operated. Protestant moral anthropology, covenant theology. Jefferson exclusively framing morality in Jesus' ethical teachings and life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth. The lived covenantal reality, e.g. African American preachers, abolitionists, Puritan political thought. 3, false equivalence, relativism fallacy, claiming morality is entirely relative or emergent across societies, like the spider wasp examples, Assyrian or Babylonian divine genocide, to dismiss divine or covenantal grounding. Response, this conflates human moral reasoning under divine covenant with the total rejection of morality. The founders' framework assumed moral duties grounded in God, not arbitrary human inventions, right? And so, for misinterpretation of nature or creator, skeptics claim nature's God is deliberately anti-Christian, pre-Christian, or neutral. And this is responses, while phrasing is philosophically influenced. Jefferson read Lucretius' Enlightenment works, got the broader covenantal and providential context, covenant language in letters, Adams, Madison, and federal oaths demonstrates a Christian moral substratum in practice. 5, appeal to personal piety, deism as disqualification. Skeptics argue Jefferson and Franklin were deists, so Christian moral influence is irrelevant. Response is, one can adopt or implement covenant moral principles without strict orthodoxy. Constantine, for example, converted a pagan empire into a Christian polity. What matters is the moral legal framework, not individual piety. Strengths of your position. Here's what I'm trying to get at, right? 1, historical evidence, quotes from Addison, Jefferson, life, Adams, Jefferson, life and morals of Jesus of Nazareth, Benneker, African American preachers, and others consistently showed that Christian moral and covenantal ideas were the animating forces behind equality, justice, and governance right in America. As far as the religious presuppositions to theoretical coherence, the American Covenant framework explains why Americans framed law, federalism, and civil orders in terms of oaths, promises, and moral obligations. It also accounts for how secularized legal structures like common law were interpreted and reshaped through covenant reasoning. Because I'm talking about covenantal theology, which ties into federalism, covenant or federal theology, right? 3, practical effect. Even if Enlightenment, deist, or classical references exist, the covenantal moral structure shape behavior, law, and policy in real life. Seen in abolitionist rhetoric, the design of the Constitution, and Puritan legal philosophy. This is the second part, the American Covenant as an interpretive lens. Definition. The American Covenant is the idea that the founding of the United States was framed as a moral and political covenant rooted in the idea of divine law, accountability to God, and mutual promises among citizens and leaders. Key features is 1, moral foundation. Law and governance are accountable to a higher moral law. Rights, duties, and justice are not purely secular, but derive legitimacy from a covenantal conception of God and human nature. 2, federalism as covenantal praxis. The Constitution and Declaration can be read as formal expressions of covenantal commitment. Separation of powers, checks and balances, and oaths are instruments of stewardship and accountability, reflecting moral responsibility rather than mere political engineering. 3, identity and the chosen people typology. American political and cultural identity draws from Hebraic covenantal models, promises, accountability, and a moral mission as Israelites of under God, right? This reinforces that America is framed as a moral nation, not just a secular republic. For compatibility with Enlightenment thought, Scottish common sense, realism, and moral philosophy influenced the founders, but this philosophy was largely Christian in origin in the American context. Classical references, Stoics, Solon, Lucretius, are tools reinterpreted through covenantal thinking. Contrast with secular pagan interpretation. Secular accounts emphasize origin and rationality detached from divine law. American covenant interpretation emphasizes moral adoption, stewardship, and identity. Ideas filtered through Christian principles, even if the rhetoric uses nature's God or Enlightenment terms. 3, recommended way to defend, like my position, or easily separate origin from meaning. Emphasize that borrowing ideas from pagans, deists, or Stoics doesn't make American governance pagan or secular. Moral reinterpretation is key, right? Which is what I've been doing, right? Because, yeah, and so on. Let me just finish. 2, point to lived practice. African American preachers, Puritans. Yeah, Benjamin Banneker. He's like the first African American scientist, right? This is like, he was like the architect, one of the architects of the White House, and he has, I think he was a free man, but he came from a family who was enslaved, I think, or a culture as well. And he was also a Christian, also challenged Jefferson on the equality, right? But based on Christian principles. How he worded it to Jefferson, right, in their correspondence. And then Jefferson's Moral Jesus Project, right, searching for the true teachings of Jesus, like, you know what I mean, what he actually taught. And then Adams's writings, yeah, the Declaration, right, what is it, how do they call, something like the causes for independence, right, general principles of Christianity, right? Covenant principle, basic general principle of Christianity. Christians are a covenant people, basically. And then reflects Lockean Christianity, dissenting Christianity, etc. And so Adam's writings. Practical application of covenantal principles trumps abstract origin. 3 highlight federalism as covenantal. Show that checks, oaths, accountability, and promises in the Constitution express stewardship, not secular calculation, which I found like books on that as well. Like this one is patriotism and piety. The other one is by Murphy called The Prodigal Nation. They deal with that idea. So I also have Daniel Ilarza's books on that as well. The Covenant Connection. And then 4, use founders' explicit Christian language. Adams, when he talks about the Hebrews' civilizing influence. Jefferson, when he talks about the moral teachings of Jesus. And then Madison talks about providence guiding government. These are not rhetorical flourishes. They reflect a consistent covenantal moral frame. Even Washington, right, in the Revolutionary War, believed he was aided by providence. And so basically, the right understanding of like belief in God is a firm belief in like a real providence, right? Like not a concept of God, right? It's like the reality of his existence or so is presupposed. Then they expose skeptics' inconsistencies. If they claim morality is emergent and non-objective, how can they justify criticizing Christianity for imposing morality and law? If they rely on pagan or indigenous systems, highlight the historical context. Exclusionary, non-universal, or non-covenantal. So bottom line, the American covenant is more than rhetorical flourish. It is a moral and structural lens through which American identity, law, and federalism were intentionally shaped. Skeptics often confuse rhetoric origin or theist influence with actual moral and legal praxis by focusing on lived history, founders' writings, and covenantal structures. You have a historically robust framework that explains why America cannot be reduced to a purely secular or pagan inheritance. Okay, I did ask it though, like, reflecting choice how covenant makes America a people that can repent of past mistakes, right? This is reflection, choice, covenantal repentance. Covenant implies moral responsibility. A covenant isn't just a contract, it's a binding moral commitment. By framing the United States as a covenant nation, the founders presupposed that citizens and leaders are accountable to a higher moral law. This moral accountability allows for reflection on collective behavior, not just adherence to secular rules, capacity to recognize past wrongs. Because the covenant presupposes a moral order, it gives Americans a framework to acknowledge violations of that order, slavery, mistreatment of indigenous peoples, or systemic injustices, right? Without such a moral baseline, repentance or meaningful reform becomes a matter of mere political expediency or not ethical duty. Choice and renewal, covenantal thinking, which also I would say covenant identity would benefit indigenous and African, even white, and just basically overall all races, right? All racial people or whatever, all Americans. Yeah, it would benefit. The idea of the covenant identity is far more powerful than identifying with oppressors and your oppression. Paul said it best, because I have the book over here called African American Readings of Paul by Bowens. Yeah, and they go over how the black church, right, starts in slavery, but obviously through the covenants of the covenantal principle, the promises of the covenant, the covenantal identity of being God's people, right? And that's why they read from stories like Exodus, let my people go, right? And so that's where I say, like, it's like that empowered, like it's that powerful, right? And so it makes us a people of God. We have belonging, identity, and you are a people, right? And you have commitment, you have a community, right? So you have all this stuff that I think would heal, like, the identity crisis going on in this country with identity politics. Like, everyone is starving for an identity and they're identifying with all these things. But for Christians, it should be that covenant identity of being the people of God, right? Paul, like I was saying, says it best when he says, he goes in Acts, I don't remember, or Romans, where it said that we're not given a spirit of slavery, but the spirit of adoption to be sons and daughters of the Most High, right? To be children of God through the spirit of the adoption, right? Which adoption is equally legitimate, right? From what I remember reading about it. It is just as legitimate as a natural born child, right? And so anyway, where was I? Choice and renewal. Covenantal thinking emphasizes that the people can choose to return to the covenantal ideals of justice, liberty, and mutual responsibility. That is why the Declaration's phrasing of self-evident truths, natural rights, and moral duties matters. It's not just rhetoric; it's a moral compass for civic action. So the covenant presupposition, even with Scottish Enlightenment, right, which is against Hume's and the skepticism, right? Like the ideas of the covenant and Scottish Enlightenment, they reinforce the values of America, right? The values of the Declaration and all that, which is exactly what you should do, rather than deteriorate them as secularism and just rhetorical things like what these seculars keep arguing for. That's all rhetorical. It's not real because God is not real, and therefore God-given rights are not real. And so everything is reduced to irrationality because of strict empiricism, right? Empirical thinking kind of thing, I guess. Or some kind of unhealthy, like some kind of skepticism that becomes unhealthy. And so historical continuity with Hebraic typology. Like Israel under God, America is conceived as a moral community whose legitimacy depends on fidelity to covenantal principles. Repentance, renewal, and reform are inherent to the covenantal identity. The nation can correct course without undermining its foundational legitimacy. 5. Federalism as covenantal structure for repentance. The Constitution's checks and balances, separation of powers, and mechanisms for amendments are instruments that operationalize covenantal accountability. Leaders and citizens are empowered to correct abuses or violations of justice in alignment with covenantal principles. All this has to do with what the American is, right? A Christian people, a covenant people, they have a God. God takes away your heart of stone, gives you a heart of flesh. He gives you this identity. So whether they believe it or not, it is the identity of the American, right? It is the deity of the American. That's what I'm presupposing, right? As far as the idea. Regardless if they are Christian or not, it doesn't matter. It's tied to the identity of what it is an American, right? That the American has a God, he has a religion, got a culture and all this other stuff. And I don't know. I'm sorry, I'm just kind of tired right now. This is, in short, the American covenant doesn't just define law or government. It defines a moral and civic identity. It allows the nation to reflect, repent, and realign with its foundational principles. Secular frameworks, by contrast, lack this built-in moral accountability. They rely on pragmatic or majority-driven adjustments rather than ethical corrections anchored in higher law. This is can secularism be complementary? Because I think it answers like different questions, right? So how secularism and the American covenant can be complementary. So 1, different domains of influence. Covenant framework anchors moral identity, civic responsibility, and the ethical underpinnings of law and governance, and answers the question, what moral and civic principles should guide our nation? Secularism, governmental neutrality, ensures that no single religious institution dominates civil law or political power. It answers the question, how should government interact with diverse religions in practice, right? 2, mutual reinforcement. A covenantal ethic can inspire citizens to pursue justice, liberty, and virtue. Secularism protects that moral pluralism by preventing coercion or favoritism, letting the covenantal ideals be pursued voluntarily rather than imposed, right? 3 practical example, Treaty of Tripoli and First Amendment. The government refrains from establishing a religion, secular principle, right, which is the church, while citizens and leaders can still act in accordance with moral, covenant-inspired convictions. Yes, that identity remains, right? And so this preserves both religious freedom and the moral grounding of civic life. 4, complementary, not contradictory. Secularism does not negate covenantal morality. It merely structures civic authority so that diverse citizens can live according to their own moral convictions without coercion. And the covenant provides identity, purpose, and ethical direction. Exactly what you need, right? This is exactly what you need for this country. Because secularism doesn't give you any real moral direction. It's because of its neutrality or something. And so while secularism provides procedural fairness and inclusivity. So it says in short, covenant explains why we should be moral and virtuous, right, as a people. And secularism explains how government can function fairly amid moral diversity, right? So, and I thought that was interesting, so I wanted to share that as well. So anyway, I think I'll stop it there. It's already kind of long. But yeah, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe. Just wanted to show like that, yeah, my position can be substantiated and defended, right? Even being more of a proper understanding of our country, right? As a Christian, nation or so. So anyway, I'm sorry, I'm tired. Yeah, if you like my videos, please like, subscribe. Thank you, and God bless.